about Swift optionals here. And this is a different concept in case you're new to Swift, because in programming languages like Java, if you're defining a global variable, then the value is always initialized. The default values will be initialized to null for objects, and for booleans it would be false, and so on. But in Swift, Swift wants to be explicit. So in case you have not initialized anything explicitly, there is actually nothing there. It's nil, and nil does not mean null. It means there is nothing. And Swift will not let you continue unless you explicitly assign the value, which is you will get a compile time error if you try and use a variable that is not already initialized. Now let's start looking at it with an example. Let's see that we have a variable, and I'm gonna intentionally have it of type boolean, and the variable name is initialized. As you can see in the playground, default value is null. Let's try and go forward and print the value of this variable to see if there is anything which is present and if Swift allows it. So I go forward and try and print the value, and immediately I get a compile time error. The compile time error says that okay, the variable is not initialized, so I'm not allowed to use it. Okay, and now it does saves a lot of if not null checks inside the code and makes the code a bit more clearer. But I need to initialize all the variables, and now you can start thinking about is well, if it knows that it is not supposed to be null, and if there is a variable which may or may not be null, then how do I work with that variable? For example, if I am actually using a variable like middle name, and it's of type string, and the middle name may or may not be present for my customers. Maybe there's a form which actually asks the customer to enter their first name, last name, and middle name, and the middle name is just not there. Then I'm not going to have it. So how do I work with it? That's where the concept of optionals come in. Now, optionals are defined by putting a question mark at the end of it, end of the data type. So once you say string question mark, now it is of type optional string, which means that this variable middle name may not get initialized in the code, and that's okay. I understand that this probably is not going to get initialized, and whenever I'm going to use this variable, I'm going to do a nil check, because I kind of know that this variable may never have been initialized before I start consuming it, because I explicitly declared it so. Now, this is not like a foreign concept in Swift. You will see Swift optionals being used throughout the place, wherever necessary. I do not recommend converting all your variables to optional, because you will have to use some extra lines of code every time you try and unwrap the value out of an optional. Before we move on, let's take a deeper look into these optionals. So I defined the middle name originally of type string, so I can use a type of function and check the value of let me comment this line so I don't keep getting compilation errors, but I can check the type of middle name. It's of type string. Then I went forward and converted it into type optional. As you see, the type has changed. The type is no longer string, but is optional containing string type. And the same is true in case I would be using booleans. So if I was using boolean like initialized, and I go forward and check the type of my type of my initialized variable, it will be optional containing type bool. So it was boolean, and now make it optional, and now it's optional containing boolean. So what is this optional? As I said earlier, Swift requires the variables to be initialized. So in case your variable is going to be nil, and whether it's of data type string or it is of data type boolean or integer, float, or any other type, it still needs something which is not nil to tell it that this variable is probably nil. Now this is done by having actually a container around the variable. So the way you can think about optionals is that Swift has this empty container, and this empty container is basically the optional type. Now this empty container can contain a variable of type int, can contain a variable of type string, can contain a variable of type boolean, and so on. But that variable inside it can be nil, may exist, may not exist, but this container will always exist. And since this container exists, we will always come to know whether what it contains is nil or a real value. Let's continue with our example of middle name. And in our example, we were just going forward and printing the middle name. Now it's of type optional, so I'm not going to get a compilation error, but I'm getting a warning because it's optional is not really string. So when I'm interpolating it, it's saying that it's going to use a debug description of the optional, which is okay, which is not off. I think the debug description is going to work for us, but for all practical purposes, you can click on it and hit on the fix and use the right format as well if you want to, which is string describing the optional value. All good, but that's for printing. Let's say I really want to use the middle name value. I have defined another variable, and then for next variable I'm gonna use is mname, and in my mname variable I want to store the value of middle name. Okay, all good and dandy. Now my variable mname type, let's see what's the type of my mname. It's also going to be of type optional string, which is not what I wanted. I wanted mname to be of type string. So let's correct that. I'm gonna go forward and say that my mname is going to be of type string, and then I'm gonna use my mname and go forward and assign it the value middle name, so that it has the same value. But now I get an error, and now I get an error because the string data type and this optional string data types are not the same, and Swift is all about clarity, so it doesn't want to do implicit conversions. It's saying that okay, well, you need to convert the optional string or unwrap the optional string to get the string and then do the assignment. This process is called unwrapping. Now for unwrapping optionals in Swift to get to their data type they actually contain, there are two options. Number one is force unwrapping. Now this is lesser desired of the two options. All you do is that you put a question mark and on in front of the variable, the optional string in this case, and it will unwrap it for you, right? But in this scenario, as you can see, is that the moment I did it, it's not giving a compilation error saying that okay, middle name is of type string and mname is of type string and middle name is of type optional string, so they do not match. It's giving me actually an execution error saying that okay, well, it's bad access because the value was nil and you try to force unwrap a nil, and that's throwing a bad instruction exception, and that's a runtime exception. It's going to crash your program there. As you can see, after this error, if I have another statement like print hello, okay, so I put another statement for print hello, and after this particular statement, then that statement is not getting printed because our code crashed and burnt at this error. Now let's see how we can bypass it. What we can do, or what we needed to do in case we are doing the force unwrapping, is that you need to do a nil check. So you say if middle name not equal to nil, okay, so if it is not equal to nil, then you are going to go forward and force unwrap the middle name. And now it's okay because middle name is actually nil, so as a result it's bypassing this if condition and never going into line number 12 and jumping on and printing till the end of the program. If I go forward and initialize the middle name and give it some value like hello there, okay, so I went forward and assigned it some value, and suddenly you can see that the middle name is now would be initialized and the value is going to be printed. So I'm gonna say, just to make sure, mname, and I'm gonna print the mname. Okay, So you will see that this piece of line is also getting executed, and the code is getting printed. But if I remove this line, then now this piece of code is not getting executed. So all good and dandy. And this is example of force unwrapping. Now this is actually not recommended because now it's relying on the developer putting in the force unwrapping piece inside if condition, but there is no syntactic check against it. Like you saw in my first example, I did not have the if condition in here, and it wasn't a compilation error for me to say that okay, well, you don't have a if condition. It was actually executing it and crashing because I was force unwrapping. And so the better option, or the swiftly option of doing this, is to do it using if let condition. So you can say if let define your variable name. I'm going to cancel this one. First of all, I'm never going to change middle name, so it should be let. So I'm going to say if let middle name equals middle name, and name equals middle name. Okay, then go forward and execute this piece of block. Okay, now what's happening here is uh, what's happening here is I'm saying that middle name is a constant, so force is going to complain out here. So I'm going to remove this value, and I'm going to make this go inside the function. But what's happening here is that I'm assigning the value of middle name to m name, but I am doing so as you can see here, I am doing so only or Swift is doing so only when there is a value to the current index. Okay, so in this scenario there was no value to the current index, so as you can see there's nothing getting executed in between line number 9 and 10, and it's empty, and then line number 15 gets printed. My middle name value will get populated if middle name is actually set. So let's look at it again, and I go forward and go to middle name and say someone here. Now I have some value to the middle name, which means is that when Swift does checks for this assignment, at that point in time, it finds a value, it assigns this to middle name, and then goes forwards and executes line number 10 and 11, which are supposed to print the middle name. So all good and dandy from that point onwards. This is the better and more Swift recommended way of handling optionals. With this, that's all you need to know about optionals in Swift.